All right, so sorry for that. Okay, so thank you for being here again and welcome. We have Kevin McDonald. He is the University of Virginia's Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Community Partnerships. He joined UVA after serving as the Chief Diversity Officer and Vice Chancellor for Inclusion, Diversity and Equity at the University of Missouri System and the University of Missouri Columbia. Prior to the University of Missouri System and Flagship campus, he held positions at several other universities, including as Vice President and as Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Rochester Institute of Technology, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Virginia Tech, as Associate Director for Compliance and Conflict Resolution at Johns Hopkins University, and as Campus Compliance Officer at the University of Maryland, College Park. Rachel Spraker, she/they, is the Senior Director for Equity and Inclusion Excellence in the Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Rachel also serves the Office of Equal Opportunity and Civil Rights. Rachel develops, implements, and evaluates policies, practices, and programs which seek to advance the representational diversity, inclusive capacity, and sense of belonging of the university's workforce and learning community. Rachel has previously served on the executive board of the American Association for Access, Equity, and Diversity, and as an equity consultant for institutions of higher education. She is also a first-generation student at UVA. And is currently a doctoral student at UVA in the School of Education and Human Development. And with that, welcome. Thank you for being here. I think Rachel wanted to give a land acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much, and thank you for letting me join you all today. I did just want to take a moment to say that at UVA in Charlottesville, we acknowledge that the land where we live, learn, and work is the ancestral homelands and traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation, who have been here since time immemorial, and we pay respect to their elders and knowledge keepers, past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the enslaved and free Black laborers who built UVA and their descendants. We are really committed as we acknowledge the land, as we acknowledge labor and knowledge, and acknowledging lives, to do that in meaningful and reciprocal relationship, both with citizens of the Monacan Indian Nation and with the descendants of the enslaved community at UVA. And so appreciate the opportunity to share that as we get started today.
Thank you. So with that, we thought it would be a good place to start with, if you could just kind of explain to us where your office fits overall in UVA's efforts to advance racial equity, and what is it responsible for?
Yeah, I'll start, and Rachel's been really engaged in that space, so I think she'll have a good amount to share. But I would say that we probably serve in three kind of function types. One would be as a conduit, right? This kind of link it, if you will, with regard to the work of racial equity at the university, both in kind of relaying it to our alums, to local community members, those who might have an interest in that, on our website, by talking about and sharing information on the work being done on those areas, and leaders providing that work from an accountability standpoint, and just updating communities on that. I think we also serve in much more of an entrepreneurial way. Both Rachel and her team and others within our division are really interested in and engaged in this space, and so kind of utilize that to be creative and innovative with regard to kind of programming and initiatives, both present and on the horizon, and that kind of developmental stage. And I think that's fantastic, and we encourage that. And then I would say thirdly, as a strong collaborative partners, there are others across grounds and even into the local community that are really engaged in this space. And we are happy to serve as both a resource and a thought partner, a collaborative partner in the development and implementation of efforts that they have going on. So I think we're kind of serving in those three spaces. There may be others, but I think we're doing that and glad to kind of serve our community. So I'll stop there.
Oh, go ahead, Rachel. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think Kevin stated a lot of it, you know, in terms of where we're at. I think several of the big ones when it talks about convening is also helping to hold space for opportunities of accountability. So some of the work that we're partnering coming out of the Racial Equity Task Force and the board's endorsement of several measures there, part of our work is really helping to articulate that, right? So I think that's part of what Kevin's talking about, and being able to keep our community updated on the progress we've made and places where we're still a work in progress, I guess.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Racial Equity Task Force and what brought it about? I see that you were tasked with it and turned around this report in, I want to say, it looks like less than 2 months, which is really remarkable. And certainly I know there was some passing of the baton. You do reference some of the other people who've been working on these issues, certainly I'm sure for decades. But if you could just speak to the task force.
Yeah, so probably kind of early June, late May, when death of George Floyd and others were kind of rocking our nation and our world, and there was a tremendous amount of activism happening. I think our incredibly engaged alums were also reflective. And I will say, and kind of pause for a minute and say that UVA has the most engaged alums out of any institution that I've worked at, you know, over 20 years in this space combined. And so they're really just incredibly engaged in a number of different spaces. They care about this work, but they also care about the university in it. So I've been really appreciative of that level of engagement. But to that point, with the level of kind of racial reckoning that was going on all over the world, our alums pointed out very factually that there had been over 50 years worth of past recommendations, demands kind of levied in the racial equity space, and not all with the appropriate attention given them by the university. And so they challenged UVA to be better and do better in that moment, to be reflective, if you will, of the past in a way that informed the present and the future. And I had an opportunity to have a conversation with the president and pitch this idea of a racial equity task force, because it was hard for me to fathom a university like UVA not ultimately giving kind of full attention to the work that was born on the backs of now alums when they were students here. And so, you know, maybe that was open for debate, and maybe there were some who felt that there was some attention given, but clearly there was a common denominator in that being offered by the alums. And so I suggested something to the president. We just had great dialogue, and I said, look, my recommendation is that your next statement regarding the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, in it, I think you should put that you are going to charge a racial equity task force with reviewing the 50 years worth of recommendations and demands, thematically coding them, and then ultimately making forth recommendations based on that. And with the understanding that, you know, it may not be feasible to accept all of them, but we have to be really thoughtful and intentional. And to move forward, we're going to have to accept some of them for sure. And he did that. And I also said that, you know, when you say this is going to be met with healthy skepticism. And so we need to do something that's going to make this task force different. and then many task force or committees that are put together in higher education, which are often charged with doing work that is a couple of years away from completion. And so I said, look, let's be aggressive. Let's utilize this moment that we have before school reopens to say we're going to have a 2-month timeline where we can also have rolling recommendations that could be accepted. And then I said, to do that effectively, I think we're going to need a small and nimble task force. We can't have a 25-person task force. And so that in itself is going to be met with skepticism as well, because we won't be able to be as inclusive as we want to do. So we have to make sure we cast the net far and wide. So that's what happened. He agreed and supported it. And I've just been incredibly appreciative of his leadership and supportive leadership. And then we had amazing people like Rachel Spraker and other team members who also played incredible roles behind the scenes that allowed us to do this work effectively, from research and coordination and writing. And so we wouldn't have gotten this work done without that amazing team of individuals who came together and gave up their summer and family and friends time to work on what was really incredible work for the university to be engaged in.
I really love the
question about that, just to follow up with what you said. So it's really important, like you were saying, about accountability and just, creating this task force is amazing, task that you guys were able to do, but how have you been able to really keep it active and funded? Because I think, and also how large is your team? Because again, this is a very heavy lift to be doing this work, and how are you able to sustain it? And, how are you getting the funding? And are you getting enough funding for this work?
Yeah, I'll start that as well. I mean, I think Rachel could have something to offer in this space for sure. She's been incredibly engaged in it. We've been both engaged in it for sure. But I would say, gosh, we had at least, 2 or 3 members from our own division. And then we had a team from the Equity Center that also had another 2 or 3 members, and we had a wonderfully collaborative doctoral student, I think at the time as well, that came in, and so anyway, we had those plus the 3 task force members that were really working around the clock, not just in setting up the meetings, but in making sure we were capturing the notes and the narratives that were shared in that space, in any of the virtual spaces we were in, editing, writing. I mean, everyone just rolled up their sleeves and participated. Now, part of the recommendations accounted for the fact that if we were going to be bold and audacious, right, and thinking about our future, it had to be attached to action that matched that rhetoric, and that action had to be steeped in some level of understanding of resources. So that's where that came in. We were not charged with figuring out where the resources were going to come from, but the president charged us with being bold, to kind of go big or go home. And so we did that with the expectation that we may not be able to achieve all of this, but there has to be something of substance. And that was really for some other aspects in the leadership to kind of figure out. And with the board endorsement, we knew that was ultimately going to happen. And so the resources have been found by and large, and they've come from multiple sources, because some could come from some funding, some had to come from just based on the recommendation itself. Might not be able to come from one source, it might have to come from another source. We have partners in our advancement office who are also helping to raise funding. So it's been a truly collaborative effort, and I'm incredibly appreciative of that. So I'll start.
Great.
I really love the urgency of it, and that it's so pragmatic, because I think that, as you mentioned, you have had 50 years of information. And I think that it's just a wonderful model for other organizations, institutions, schools to consider, because these issues are not new. These issues are longstanding. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. And that many places have this information, but there can be a sort of paralysis to get it perfect. And that's not to say that you're not doing it intentionally and thoughtfully and in a deliberate manner, but at the same time, a sense that these are serious issues that we really need to work on with some deliberate speed. So I think that's a wonderful takeaway for folks. I know that Rachel's working on one piece which deals with anti-racism education for the staff. Could you tell us more, Rachel, about that and what that looks like and how that's going?
Yeah, I definitely can. So I think one of the things that we sort of started working on right after the Racial Equity Task Force, knowing what would be sort of coming out of there and what we thought might get endorsed, was to actually start to work a little bit internally first to define a little bit more about what we think anti-racism education is actually. And so that's something that we as a division have started in terms of what that work does, right? Examining the historical roots and those sort of contemporary manifestations of racial hierarchy, that building out the ability for participants who go through that program to explore the influence of race and culture on their own sort of personal and professional attitudes and behaviors, helping people understand how it's not just about sort of you outside, but how that comes into the workplace in particular. And then really thinking about how we provide folks with the theoretical tools for actually analyzing that, right? For thinking about the unequal production of society and the power relations that are bound up in that. So we spent a little bit of time at first thinking about what is it that we mean when we say this thing, anti-racism, so that we could actually define some anchors for the work. I'll say that we had the benefit of, you had asked a question before about our sort of infrastructure, right? And the thing that I can say is, while our office is growing, and importantly, we actually just got a new role for a director of diversity education, who's going to help us roll this out in a more impactful way and sustainable way. We have really strong partners all across our university. We're very lucky in terms of the investments that people across the institution have made, both in our central office, but every school at the university now has an associate dean for diversity and inclusion. Several of our operational areas, including safety and security, the police department, have folks who are now sort of focused on that. And so we have an amazing set of partners all across our institution, because I think it does take all of us. So with that, we were able to bring a community of practice together to roll out dialogues with more than 300 people in the summer of 2020, which is not necessarily a lot in terms of our total size, but actually being able to facilitate that. We actually named that sort of remembering for our future, to understand that it's important for us to remember not that we live in the past, but to learn from the past and how we might imagine different possibilities. So between that and our racial equity speaker series, where we had some great folks like Eddie Glaude Jr. and Ibram Kendi, and others within our community, like Laura Morgan Roberts, we were able to get to over 2,000 people in this past year, just from the work we've been doing, not to mention what's been happening all around our university with programs, people doing a lot of work like what you do, right, in terms of reading groups and challenges to sort of just talk about it more. And the work keeps going right now.
Remembering our future, I love that. Can you talk about, last weekend in Charlottesville, there was the removal of the Confederate monuments, and I know at UVA on the grounds or near the corner, the George Rogers Clark statue was removed, and you have the new memorial for enslaved laborers from the university. Can you just talk about these monuments, these memorials, and how you see them playing a role in racial equity?
I felt like I was dominating, so I just wanted, I thought.
I want you to take that one, Kevin.
Well, I would say one of the things that was loud and clear from our racial equity task force work was the trauma that those monuments were having on a daily basis for our community members that were being subjected to them as passersby, right? And I think our work, particularly this notion of the racial equity work being rooted in our inclusive excellence strategic framework, but also having us a sixth area of healing repair, right? That work of repair and healing had to involve, I think, being intentional about steps being taken to remove that. And so I think by many's representation, the removal of those statues were an important step in the right direction. There were members of our indigenous community who were present when George Rogers Clark was being removed and really remarked. I think some, were overcome with emotion, right? And so it wasn't the end all be all, that meaning that there's still plenty of work to be done in that healing and repair space, but it was a step in the right direction. And I think they acknowledged that. And so it needs to have its important place in time, but also we can't take our foot off the gas of this work, and we have to continue to look to what that evolution of healing and repair needs to be for the communities impacted, by those symbols, of racism, for sure.
Have you had any pushback or, heard of any pushback of the community or the community at large, people that live in Charlottesville who really don't want those, statues to be removed? How are you dealing with that kind of pushback?
Yeah, I was told that there was some pushback, but I think it's to be expected in the work. For sure, even in our racial equity work, not everyone was enamored with it. But what I appreciate about our leadership is the recognition that this is an important step, a right step, and the university has to unapologetically be moving forward. I think it was the same thing with the removal of the statues, both at the city, the county, at the level of UVA. So I'm incredibly appreciative of that recognition and the efforts, and I'm glad to be a part of a community that is unapologetically moving forward, recognizing that it is the right thing to do and clearly the right time to do it. I think Rachel was also going to say something maybe from before.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, of course, there has been pushback, right, from a lot of different spaces. But I think, this is one of those spaces where we know words and symbols matter. Their removal is important, but often insufficient. And what Kevin was just saying there, I think, both in terms of our leadership at the university, but also thinking about, again, the community partners we have. I know locally, actually, even just today, there's a group locally that's looking at what would a community-based commission for sort of healing and transformation look like, right? To actually do something local on the ground in a way that every time we have this sort of clearing away of those symbols, that it opens up new space for change and deeper sort of structural engagements. And I think that's the other thing about thinking about the way you're rooted in community. And it's not necessarily a thing that UVA has always seen itself as, right? I think we're sort of growing in what it means to be truly an anchor institution and working in reciprocity with the community. But that's one of the things I value about being here, is that we do actually have really strong community partners who can think this for us, with us, through us, around us, and just really appreciate that, because I think it has opened up space for new beginnings in our community, and to continue the work that's been going on for a long time.
In that same vein, I think, Rachel, when we talked previously, you mentioned some of the healing and repair work that you are working with as part of your role. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin, happy to have you kind of connect in here anywhere where you think it makes sense, right? I mean, I think one of the things that we're really trying to focus on is that we understand the materiality of what needs to sort of change. So again, moving from those symbols to what would it actually look like to sort of be in a different relationship. And so you'll see in the task force report, you know, there are things around building out scholarships, right, for descendants of the enslaved community at UVA. You know, we actually have a real recent thing when we think about the materiality of repairing, right? You know, we celebrated Juneteenth just last month. We had a partner at the university in the bookstore who, you know, proceeds actually went to, they usually go to the Access UVA scholarships, but went to the Ridley Scholarship, right, which is specifically for Black and African American students kind of coming in. And thinking about things like, and the last thing I'll mention, then maybe Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about some of this too. You know, one of the things that we has actually just started happening is our office has an Inclusive Excellence faculty fellow who is going to be working to sort of better understand the types of relationships and communication that sovereign Indigenous nations may want to have with the university, both in terms of educational type things, but also just the way that we are in these spaces. And so we're looking to do things like that, you know, through educational programming and partnership, both with Monacan Indian Nation, for example, but also very specifically the descendants of slave communities at UVA, and utilizing the memorial as sort of an anchor to do some of that work, in particular in the community.
Yeah, I'd only add that we are really trying to be intentional in our space with our Native American community, and we're invited to kind of collaborate and provide support, do that with thoughtfulness. There is a desire to create a tribal consultation policy that will govern, you know, our relationships as an institution when there are intersections with our Native American community on issues, on areas. And so that our faculty fellow is also kind of working on that as well. There is a desire to build a stronger pipeline for Native American students. We have been currently working with our descendants of enslaved communities as well on an MOU with the university. So in addition to kind of exploration of scholarships, really trying to build out a sustainable relationship with our descendant communities as well, and have an ongoing. In fact, the university hired a researcher to continue to research enslaved names and continue to add to a memorial that we have, right? And so I think those are steps in the right direction. We recognize, as the communities that we are trying to work collaboratively with and support and serve, that there's more to do. And I think we continue to be reflective on that, and where we can nudge our leadership and try to create important spaces for dialogue that will allow us to achieve some of those ends in the months and years ahead.
So in your, the task force came away with 12 key initiatives, and now, you know, it's almost a year later, and I'll just say that generally in this space, we've seen, you know, some waning and maybe people being tired. You know, obviously this is work that is hard and it takes sustained effort. Are there things that you're learning have been effective, especially effective in kind of dealing with that and keeping the fire going and keeping people really engaged?
You know, this is, I think, my sixth institution that I've worked at, and I've been incredibly encouraged and energized by the collaborative spirit across grounds. I don't think that's part of UVA's history. And I think as a decentralized kind of university, everything has been really diffused and people are very comfortable working in silos. But I think the moment that we're in really struck a chord. And I think people recognize that we are much stronger together than we are apart. And so the collaborative spirit and identifying synergistic intersections have been plentiful. I think we've tried to model that as a division, and so I think that has helped as well. I think I can't say enough about supportive leadership. So I've definitely been in spaces where if you don't have that, it's hard to get any of this going. But our president has not only, I mean, has really supported a lot of our efforts from day one. So our inclusive excellence framework was really endorsed by our president. In fact, we think we're pretty creative in our division, but he kind of went up that and wanted to do an actual video conversation with he and I on the importance of it. So I think that was incredibly helpful. He has been the same way about pushing our racial equity work. I mean, he really wanted, and Rachel was already thinking in these terms as well, of being able to represent in very transparent ways our work and update it on our website. But the president was really also encouraging us and pushing us to say, hey, when will that be ready? When can we roll it out? And really wanting to make sure. So that's really helpful and really important as well. And I think our board has strong interest. So to hit the trifecta of not just having your community members support it, but having your presidential leadership support it, and then having your board endorse it and push it forward, I think that for us has been incredibly helpful. The last thing I'll say is what I also appreciate about our colleagues is in a lot of their work, their research, their scholarship, their grant proposals, they're really trying to root racial equity. And so we have deans who are making important hires that are focused on racial equity. We have grants that we've been provided that have added additional scholars focused on racial equity at postdocs. I mean, we have 30 descending upon our university that will all be focused on racial equity in some way, shape, or form. I think that's tremendous, and we can't really kind of understate that. So I am appreciative. Again, I don't know enough about UVA's history to know if everyone already had that spirit. Rachel might be able to speak to that, but I know that whatever moment we're in, the chord has been struck and everyone is wanting to sing from the same musical score. And I'm incredibly appreciative of that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think what keeps some of the fire going is that it's a fire that's been burning for a very long time at the university. And so that's been helpful. I mean, I think outside of the Summer of Racial Reckoning, August 11th and 12th, 2017 in Charlottesville set up our community to be in a different space and to be thinking about these. But we've had so many different moments before then, some of them where we've been able to again, what Kevin was saying, when you have pathways that open up through leadership to make things possible in response, it's really, really helpful. But I think part of the way the fire keeps going is that just like looking back at more than 50 years of engaged students in particular, right? Kind of bringing these issues up, and our students are smart and they are they understand what's going on and they want to keep us honest, and we want them to do that. And I think that's something that, when we think about the university has been looking at its history around enslavement actually back since 2012, 2013, right? We're one of the early schools kind of doing deeper studies on that. And that came about because of student activism, right? In a long tradition of student and faculty and staff and alumni and community partnership and engagement. So I think part of what keeps the fire sort of lit is that it's a fire that's been going for a very long time here.
Rachel, can you talk a little bit more about the student activism and how the students are playing a role in the task force? Because how and when do they come into the conversation with you all as you're building, like what's important for the task force to be focusing on? Because I'm sure there's probably lots of different directions that you can go, right? So what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's been a balance, and I'll let maybe Kevin talk a little bit about that. So, most of those documents, those historical documents, vast majority of them were actually petitions to the university from student groups, right? There were a few in there that were sort of reports from prior sort of racial equity type or diversity type committees or task force for things that were sometimes fulfilled, sometimes not fulfilled, right? But the majority of those were petitions to the university from student groups, you know, a range of student groups, right? When we actually undertook the work of doing kind of the analysis to inform the task force recommendations, we also spent a lot of time trying to organize opportunities for students to meet with the task force. I know we did some work behind the scenes setting up meetings, but Kevin and Ian Solomon, the Dean of Baton, and Barbara Brown Wilson, who chaired it, they were just daily in meetings with a lot of different stakeholders. And I think, you know, we had the trouble of being sort of over the summer at that time. And you're always a little bit limited to the structures that you know, right? So we were talking to the Black Student Alliance, the Native American Student Union, the Minority Rights Coalition, kind of a lot of those active student groups that we have that we know of, but trying to open up, this is why we had an open comment. So we actually put up on the website sort of supporting it as we announced it, you know, the ability to just get feedback from anyone in the community and to take every single piece of that in and wrap it into the work and sort of like Kevin said, to start to code it thematically so that we could actually have a map kind of and make those connections of what people were talking about. So direct conversations, but honestly, just a lot of time conversations in the past, petitions, those types of things. And I think, you know, the hardest part is as we continue to do the work, right? How do we keep them engaged? Our office, we have Inclusive Excellence Student Fellows as well, is one way we're trying to have folks come in that way. I know the student representative to the Board of Visitors is very interested in this type of work. So that's another sort of pathway in, but you know, I think sometimes the implementation part is harder to keep students actively engaged with as opposed to that lead up. And I don't know, Kevin, if you have thoughts about that question also from Lynn.
Yeah, you know, I had the honor of meeting with the incoming new student leadership as well as participating as a kind of a speaker for a group, a leadership development group that they have called the Meriwether Lewis Leadership maybe Institute, and I challenge those students because I know that how incredibly passionate they are in this space to engage with our division, to be able to share their ideas. I offered to take them out to lunch, and many took me up on that, and so. They have some great ideas about how to move this important work forward. And I think they just want an opportunity to be seen as a true and viable partner. And so I think we want to continue to do that and encourage that from a divisional standpoint. And it's clear that the students will step up to that opportunity. We have had student organizations that have actually adopted our inclusive excellence framework. So it wasn't just for academic and administrative units, but we've had students do that. So that's incredibly encouraging. But again, we have a wave of support because even that framework has been adopted in our local community, has been adopted by the governor of our state. And when people even reflect on the racial equity work and how it was centered and rooted in our inclusive excellence framework and has that healing and repair section, there are many that are wanting to add that as well, right? I just, again, had this conversation with two representatives from Tulane today, and they're reflecting on their history. They also want to center healing and repair. So, so it's a great, I'm just grateful to be a part of those dedicated to this work, and grateful to be a part of an amazing team of individuals that we wake up every day kind of thinking about this, and it's a great place to be in.
Yeah, I think what you described is certainly an openness, and I think that there's often fear of what you're going to learn about or fear of a particular history. And what you're really showing is that when you're open and you embrace it, you're getting all of these ideas that really there's nothing that you can't handle, but you just need to be open to it. Can you talk a little bit more about the framework?
Can I add one thing to it?
Sure, certainly.
And just reflecting on my time, something that you said that just triggered this, but reflecting on my time at the University of Missouri, my position so I came there, came to UVA from the University of Missouri system and their flagship campus. I had 2 roles there, but my position at the system was created out of the student protest that happened there in 2015, and that was ignited by the death of Michael Brown at Ferguson, right? And it also was the touch point, kind of the jump off point for 80 additional protests with demands across institutions across the nation, right? But one of the things that the students told me was that the protests happened because of a lack of engagement by administration, right? And that that it didn't just happen out of thin air, that they had been trying to engage administration 2 years prior to that. So that's why I continue to talk in very positive ways about how it feels like in this moment, our administration is really trying to engage and stay engaged and be open and not defensive and try to be transparent. Don't overpromise and underdeliver, because I came from a space where when that didn't happen, it was everything that just culminated at once, right? I mean, you had everything from interest convergence, or kind of critical race theorists would say interest convergence with a football team that boycotted playing. You had a hunger strike. You had all of these things that happened that led to the resignation of a president of a system and a chancellor of the flagship campus. So I'm incredibly important. And again, it does speak to the need to continue to engage. You can't stop. You have to continue to do it in very pervasive ways. And everyone has something to share as a member of your community.
I do think, though, you made some incredibly important points, and that is, I think we hear so many people who say they don't think they have power, they don't think there's anything they can do. And these students that you're talking about have shown that, collectively, we do have power, and people have to come together and use their voices. So yeah, that's incredibly powerful.
I would actually just, as you're saying that, one of the things in one of the educational programs we have so far, we actually quote a couple of folks, and one of them being, kind of connected to Grace Lee Boggs, which I'm not sure if you or others on the sort of know, but thinking about the way that we use our power and that we can all be leaders sort of from wherever we are, I think is really important. And then the other thing in terms of the anti-racist principles that we use in our sessions, we talk specifically about what some of those are in terms of using the work from groups like Undoing Racism, of gatekeeping and what that means when we understand that all of us are actually part of this. Because I think the work can be really overwhelming, but what we try to remind people is that, the organizations we're in, organizations don't think and do. We, the people who make up those organizations, think and do, and that gives us power, and that's important to remember. There may be systems that make it harder for us to do that work, but day to day, we think and do as the people who sort of make these up, and that's really important and part of what we're trying to do to co-create and engage and empower our communities to work in that way. And it's not always easy. We have open leadership and reception in a lot of ways, but giving up power in that way is hard, right? And so it's something I think continuing to work on.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about, one of the things inherent in this work is that one of the barriers that comes up is that the emotionality of it, people, anger, blame, shame, guilt, all that kind of, a wall is up because people don't want to reckon with it. They don't want to feel it. It doesn't feel good. Have you found an approach or technique? I mean, I hear you with the healing and the repair, and I don't know if that, really helps with that piece, or maybe you can speak to what you found to be helpful with kind of counterbalancing that.
Well, I would say one of the things that's incredibly important is demonstrable action. I think that has really been helpful, meaning that there are often times, particularly in the wake of a type of crisis, a racial crisis, where there's a lot of gray rhetoric that doesn't ultimately result outside of a report with demonstrable action. And I think that can lead to particularly kind of racial battle fatigue and maybe of a questioning of what was the motivation behind it, was it really worth it all? And I think what
Mm.
has helped here is that we have had at least a steady stream of efforts that we can point to that have been done. We've tried to update the community, not just our division, but central communications, the president, to really provide some updates. I think all of that has helped and provided moments of encouragement, and that people can definitely poke holes and say, you know, that's great, but we want this, or we want this, we want more. But but rarely have we found people to say that nothing was done. I think that's been incredibly helpful for sustaining belief that we might be able to be turning what really feels like this huge glacier of effort, but actually seeing in very demonstrable ways kind of efforts being done. I think that's helpful. And I know, because I've been in spaces when you don't have that, and talk to colleagues across the nation, that, you know, you've had fits and starts, or it looked promising and then, you know, ended up being dead on arrival. And that can really take the wind out of people's sails, and it makes it harder to ultimately have additional kind of conversations around this. So I think that is, I will say that I think that has been a major contribution. Think about it. So we've had a number of things happen. Then we just had the removal of these two statues. So that ultimately put a little more gas in the tank. Well, I guess we can continue to move forward, right? We've had names removed from buildings. Okay, I guess we can continue to press on. So even when you start to wane, you're like, wow, it's still some more work being done. And I'm even our own unit, our office, out of our racial equity task force efforts, the community recommended additional resources. So from the office's creation in 2005, the positions that many of which, two of which are under Rachel's leadership, didn't exist, right? And so to be able to have that, and it means that we don't have the narrative of being expected to do more with less. So even in our own team, Rachel can wake up with renewed energy, because it was really Rachel in some matrix fashion, turning herself into 3 and 4 people to do this work. And I had no idea when she was sleeping. So now the pep in her step and the energy in in her voice, because she has an additional team to work with her, is helpful. So it helps us as well to sustain our efforts. And it's almost a built-in level of self-care for us. So.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate that, Kevin, and not only, I mean, sort of the level that you were speaking of, and also for it is true. It's nice to actually have people to help do the work, right? Because I think that is something we've struggled with. I think your question about the emotionality, I because of the work that I do, which is often in those moments of dialogue with our community, in those moments where we're in a session and folks are on that learning edge, right? And something that you're probably sort of working with too, is you actually talk to people who are kind of going into that space. That emotionality can be a barrier. I think particularly for people, I'm a queer white settler, right? There's stuff that comes up for me in terms of all that we know about engaging in this work, and there's no getting around. Kevin and I work at a predominantly and historically white institution, right? So there's a lot of emotionality in a lot of different ways. I think one thing that's been important for us in some of our at least education work, and specifically the anti-racism education work, is to help people understand that our goal is really simply just to give them context and tools for reflecting on the world around them. And so specifically for white folks, right? I think, and I'll just be sort of out there if I can, right? Which is that often it's about helping them, because they're hearing a lot in the world around them. Often it's really about helping them focus on the distinction of whiteness as an identity and whiteness as an ideology, right? And being able to make that distinction, giving them thinking tools and reflection tools to understand that difference of when you're talking about ideology, which is where a lot of it sits, is that you're really talking about those structures, right? And what that means as opposed to who I show up as a person in a particular way. So I think that ideology, identity kind of distinction can help white people in particular handle some of that emotionality. But I will say, because we do a lot of sessions that are sort of interracial, right? For Black, Indigenous, other people of color who kind of come into those spaces, it's often frustrating. And we try to do the best we can. I mean, frustrating is the nice way of saying it. It's hurtful. It's really hurtful at times. And so we do the best we can to spend time talking about the commitments that we're going to make to each other when we're in dialogue. And in particular, we really try to talk about how we want to center, for example, Black voices and sort of share stories of everyday resilience and cultural contributions and thrivance in the face of a lot of those obstacles, because it's stories, those are stories that don't get told, and those are stories that are often told from a white gaze and not actually centered on Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx folks, right? And I think that's been something, that emotionality is hard too. And I think still working on what that looks like.
A question for you, Rachel. It's kind of a personal question. I just wonder, because we, have a lot of non-Black allies that are at the anti-racist table trying to do the work every day. What is it that you could say for yourself has been your why that has kept you motivated, especially when you began this journey of really centering anti-racism and, equity for all? What was it that was your why that you came back to? Because again, for you as a, white female, that you have a lot of privilege, so you don't necessarily have to do this work. So just what carries you through, so that maybe we can inspire some of our participants who are trying to find their why of why they're picking this up every day to do this work when they could just put it on the shelf.
Yeah, that sort of privilege of ignorance and sort of the sort of fallacy of innocence. I think what's been important for me, so I think what's part of my bio that other folks might know or not know is that, I grew up in rural Appalachia. And I think that there are a couple things, but really actually when I was an undergraduate at UVA, I had the opportunity to take a class with Julian Bond, who, as many may know, is an amazing, he's been amazing for the university. Obviously he passed away a couple of years ago, but I had the opportunity to learn from him in particular ways and to be given those thinking tools that let me see differently, and also let me see, I don't know if you all have taken up Metzel's book, sort of Dying of Whiteness necessarily in your reading groups. But I think, the space that I've been in where I grew up, you could see it, right? The way that white people are actually dying of whiteness too. In my immediate sort of peer group, it's kind of personal, right? But it's like I had a couple of cousins, they had friends, like the sort of toxicity of whiteness around them and certain things that were happening for them. Many of them were dying prematurely also, right? Sort of in their 20s, and I think it's just, I've had a range of experiences that have helped me see that, and to see how anti-Blackness, racism in general, and white supremacy in particular, that actually limits my self-authorship for who I can be as a person. And I think it's a lot of different things that get people to that. But for me, that's a lot of what it was about, right? Is like, I can't actually be who I could possibly be because I'm stuck in this too. And so I don't feel it. I don't feel the harm in the same way. But for all of us who are sort of looking for that, you talked about liberation at the very beginning, which I think is really much about, a lot about that sort of, how do we write our own destinies, right? I think I can't do that because of this. And I see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? But I think it takes a lot of different things to get people there. And I don't know if that's helpful to some or not, because I've had a particularly unique journey, I think, in that way.
Thank you so much, for sharing that. That's very helpful.
You guys have filled us with all kinds of gems and things that we're going to be using in our work. And we have 1 minute left, and we want to still ask you, what's inspiring you right now?
Yeah. Are you reading anything? Are you watching anything that's just for fun, that's inspiring you, filling your cup? What can you share with us just from your personal lives?
Rachel will probably be steeped in much more of a theoretical framework than I, but let me just say, really simplistically, I think what's filling me and energizing me is continuing to grow a team of individuals who are bringing their whole selves, are having the creative latitude to be transformational, and are having the energy in this moment to want to impact positively the lives of people. And I think, we're trying to create that culture, but just being able to have much more of a full team to do that and engage in this work with is incredibly inspiring to me and energizing, because I just, Rachel and I will spend part of our one-on-ones dreaming big about what we're going to do. And I like that, you know, I like that Rachel liked that. I like that other team members like that, that we don't feel as though we don't, you know, we have to maintain some status quo. So that is the simple part for me that is energizing.
Yeah, I think actually there was something that we talked about, Kristen, at the very beginning, that, you know, there are a lot of different things that are filling me up, and seeing some of that work actually happen is one of them, right? And being able to participate with groups like our Native American Indigenous Studies and group to sort of, as we're clearing out things like the George Rogers Clark statue, to be able to be there for some of those moments of cleansing is inspiring, and thinking about what that new beginning could be. But honestly, I have to say, it was nice to meet your son at the beginning of this call, who's going to be coming to UVA. And we are serious. He needs to come visit us and be a part of it. And that actually fills me up too, because I think we have people who are coming here. There are a lot of stories about our institution, some of them accurate, some of them less accurate. But I will say that, you know, we have amazing people here who are unlike what most people think they are or will be or can be. And I think that's actually what fills me up, is seeing the possibility through the work that we do. And so I mean it, you should come visit.
He's going to. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. But really thank you for your leadership, what you're doing at the university. You're really out there as a leader for other institutions and organizations to follow. And we are going to continue to point to you as an example. The audacious nature that you are out there is just what we need right now. So thank you again.
And your board and your leadership that's really, you know, carrying the torch alongside you as you're, you know, navigating this new terrain and really trying to bring change to the university and beyond in the community. So thanks to your president and everyone else.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
You can stop this recording. Here we go.